A.T. Fomenko and G.V. Nosovsky, How It Was in Reality. Introduction. The Epic Before the 11th Century. This section is very short. There is no information in surviving written sources about any events prior to the 11th century. There was no writing at that time. It appeared only in the 10th to 11th centuries. According to Scaliger's history, writing originated in ancient antiquity, allegedly well before the beginning of A.D. In reality, the written history of mankind first emerges from the gloom only in the 10th to 11th centuries. All surviving ancient documents, including those attributed to deep antiquity, in reality, describe the events of the 11th to 17th centuries. Many of them were forcibly consigned to the distant past by the erroneous chronology of Scaliger Petavius. The epoch prior to the 11th century should be envisioned as primeval, the dawn of civilization. Primitive tools from those times have survived to this day and are exhibited in museums and galleries dedicated to early man, who allegedly lived many centuries and even millennium BC. Pottery fragments, bones, flint tools, stone knives and axes, scrapers, ashes of cave fires, bone and stone arrowheads and spearheads, ornaments made of mammoth bones and teeth of predators. It is these galleries of the modern museums that give us an accurate indication on human life up to the 10th to 11th centuries. During that time, people still dwelt in caves and dugouts. They didn't yet possess the know-how to build any significant structures, let alone any buildings of wood or stone. But we shouldn't assume that the stone and bone implements and everyday objects became obsolete during the 11th century. In reality, they existed and were widely used significantly later, up until the 15th to 16th centuries. For example, in the 16th century, the Germans came to build the Moscow Kremlin with their stone axes, which contemporary German historians tentatively date to the 2nd century BC. Figure 1. Chapter 10, Part 4. Thus, the stone tools coexisted with the metal ones up until the 16th century. The construction of the Moscow Kremlin is dated by the historians as the end of the 15th century, but in the new chronology it is attributed to the second half of the 16th century. It turns out that all such axes, and there are quite a few in Germany, are currently dated by the archaeologist to the deepest antiquity, the first half of the 2nd century BC. The scientists and archaeologists' view that the stone tools found in Europe are exclusively tools of the prehistoric time is flawed. As we can see, the Germans in the 15th to 16th century AD were still heavily reliant on the use of stone axes. This incidentally implies a simple solution to a famous historical puzzle. How did the allegedly ancient cave people manage to make the round or oval holes of a regular shape in the stone tools? Here, for example, is most ancient stone axe in the Ohrid Archaeological Museum in Macedonia, Chapter 10, Part 4. A deep oblong hole with the even vertical walls was made from a hard stone. Could a caveman, who didn't have any tools, make such a thing? Surely you cannot achieve such a regular-shaped hole simply by scraping one stone against the other by hand. However now, when we understand that the stone tools were used up until the 16th century, everything fits together. The holes in the stone axes could be made by using the mechanisms with rotating drills, which could have been diamond-tipped, for example, or simply made out of hard rock. Another example. We are told that in Russia, in ancient Rome, and in England, they were writing on birch bark, and it was a very long time ago. In fact, as it turns out, the birch bark letters were in use up until the 19th century, and in some places even until the 20th century. The thing is that up until the 20th century, paper was not clean. The birch bark, particularly in the north, was much cheaper. 4v1, chapter 3, parts 11 and 12. Thus, antiquity becomes considerably closer to our time. Contemporary textbooks tell us in a lot of detail about people's lives in the epoch allegedly earlier than the 10th century. Let us remember some ancient cultures. The legendary Sumerians, the most ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia and America, the powerful pharaohs of Egypt, the Trojan Kingdom and the notorious Trojan War of the allegedly 13th century BC, lyricized by the blind poet Homer, the enlightened ancient China, the mighty Etruscans, the great ancient Greek civilization, even more ancient Rome, which evolved from the Etruscan civilization, ancient Carthage, and its wars with the mighty Rome, mysterious ancient India with its treasures, the mighty early and medieval Arab caliphates, the earliest biblical kingdoms of Israel and Judea, the ancient Assyria, Syria, and Persia, the medieval European feudal lords in their mighty, gloomy castles. All of this, they tell us, existed before the 10th century AD. It is not true. All of this did exist, but in a completely different epoch, and moreover, often in a different location. More specifically, after the 10th century AD, i.e., in the last millennium. In other words, the dates of all the events of the classical antiquity should be corrected, moved upwards to their true places in the interval between the 10th and 17th centuries. Where were the first settlements situated before the 10th century? Presumably, at first, the majority of people lived in a warm zone, not far from the equator, in particular in the Mediterranean, India, and Central America. The climate there was equable. There were a lot of fruit-bearing plants and enough drinking water. This promoted the fast procreation of people. There was enough food. There were no cold winters, and it was easy to build dwellings. There were neither climate contrasts nor substantial temperature differences. But the rampant procreation could not last forever. Soon, it became too congested. The intertribal conflicts began, as well as the struggle for territory and food. A part of the population was driven out to the north and to the south. Having found themselves in the Midland, the people discovered that the climate there was much more severe. The winters were cold, noticeably less food. It was necessary to build dwellings to survive in the bitter winter cold. The weak migrants perished, but those who survived did so only because they managed to adapt. The load on the intellect increased. It was necessary to create house-building methods, agricultural tools, and equipment for hunting and navigation on the rivers and the sea, etc. In other words, these people were compelled to develop a civilization. Over the course of time, the descendants of the first wave of migrants, having adapted to the new environment, created their own cultural centers, and after reproducing in large enough quantities, began to widen the zone of their habitat. The colonization had begun, but on a higher technological level. It is possible that is how the epoch of the 13th to 14th centuries began, but we'll talk about it later. And now, let us go back in time. To conclude, The epoch before the 11th century is immersed in darkness due to the virtually total absence of any surviving documents of that time. We will repeat that only in the 10th to 11th centuries, for the first time there was conceived the very idea of written language, possibly in ancient Egypt, originally in a form of hieroglyphs, pictures. The recording of thoughts in this way is primary, and only later evolved into the more contemporary forms. End introduction.